There you go. And so before we get started, and I'm sure people will join in as they come, but I just want to get us started. So we anticipate, we aim to end this around 6:30, and so just a heads up for everyone on that note. Before we get into Nadia's presentation, there are a few things that I would like to go over with everyone here. Some rules and / expectations for everyone as we gather for our time together. So Nadia will first start with her presentation and whatever she has for us, and then after our presentation will be a discussion / a Q&A kind of a thing. We will take questions, but for that part, please write them. If you have questions, please write them in the chat, and I will parse them out as the questions come. We will do our best to answer every question, and from the looks of it, that's likely that we'll be able to, or I mean, who knows, but we'll be able to answer a lot of your questions at least. And we're excited we're really excited to have this discussion today. One quick thing I will like to bring up is that we will, as much as we're looking forward to this discussion, we will not heed the floor for comments that are intended to derail the event. And so I just want to make that clear. And so comments and questions, please limit that to about 1 to 2 minutes, just because we just want to respect the time of everyone listening at this moment. Yeah, I mean, Nadia, do you have anything you wanted to add or anything?
No, thank you all for inviting me. I have something at the very beginning, just in case there were not if it's too much, we don't have to do it, but I just always like to know who's in the room. So maybe if it feels right, we could just go through name, pronoun, and kind of why you're here or something you're hoping to learn. And then I can also keep that in mind to make sure I cover some of the things that folks are most interested in.
Yeah, I mean, Anu, do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a wonderful. Why don't I begin, and then I will just invite somebody to share after me, okay?
Yeah.
And then Michael, as anybody who gets left out at the end, you just simply call on them to make sure that they get introduced.
Yep.
I'm Sonny Kang. I'm the pastor of United University Church, also Hope on Union, and I'm one of the religious directors at USC, and I am Progressive Christians at USC, which is one of the sponsors of this event. Is a church, is an organization that my church sponsors, and then why don't we go to Michael? Why don't you go next?
Yeah, sure. My name is Michael, pronouns he, him, his. I am a senior, double major in NGOs and social change and religion. And I help lead Progressive Christians at USC. So, Eddie, would you like to go?
Sure. All right, my name is Eddie. I'm a senior studying international relations. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm here because it kind of falls in line with my academic interests, but also like I really enjoy everything that Michael and Sunny have brought to Interfaith Council, because I'm also involved in that. So I wanted to show up and be here, show support for what seems like a really cool event. And I guess I'll pass it off to Christina.
So I'm Christina. I'm a sophomore majoring in political science. So this is also related to my major. Pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm not super familiar with what's going on in Palestine. So I'm excited to learn what's up and what we can do about it. Melody, do you want to share next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Melody. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a freshman majoring in interactive media and games. And like Christina, I'm just like not super informed on what's going on in Palestine. So I would like to learn more. Monique, would you like to go?
Sure. Hi, I'm Monique. I'm actually a graduate student at the Marshall School of Business, and I am focused on social entrepreneurship. And I had a mission trip to Israel to host a youth camp for the Palestinian and the Israeli children, and we were not able to go. And so I'm just kind of interested in understanding what's going on there right now.
Monique, would you like to invite someone else to share?
Sure. Is it Marika?
Hi, my name is Marika, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a junior studying computer science game development. I guess I'd just like to learn more about Palestine and the Palestinian community and get a personal perspective on it.
Mark, would you like to share?
Whoops, I can share. Sorry, I'm wandering around the house here as I talk. I'm Mark and my wife Kay. We're both listening in. We do not belong to your community, but we go back a long time with Pastor Sonny. So, and we have a interest in the topic. So Sonny was nice enough to invite me, and so we're going to listen in, if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you for joining us.
Mark and I go back to college 40 years ago, so.
A long time ago.
Great. Oh, and by the way, Nadia, just to let you know, Mark is joining us from Duluth, Minnesota, and Marika is in Texas right now, and Christina is up in upstate New York in Rochester. And Monique, where are you right now? Are you in LA?
Yes.
Okay. So we're just all over. Just want you to know. So that's great.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much for having me and for introducing yourselves. Michael, is it okay if I just go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Nadya. I'm born and raised in the Bay Area. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am a Palestinian organizer. I am born first generation here in the United States. And I come from a father who was born and is a refugee. He was a refugee in Jordan, but originally from Palestinian grandparents who were displaced in the Nakba in 1948. If you don't know much about Nakba, don't worry. I'm going to go through like a 20-minute primer on Palestinian history and history of the region. And I'm going to try to make it engaging and understandable, which is hard to do sometimes with dry dates, but I'm going to do my best to make it really interesting. If you say I say a term and you don't understand it, please go ahead and write it in the chat. Or just, raise your hand to make sure that we're kind of on the same page. And the idea of this is just to give you an idea of the structure. I'm going to go through some important historical dates and information, and then I'm going to go into present events. And I think that's important because through that we can kind of unpack the roots of some of the terms that we use to talk about Palestine. Where things like occupation, the term occupation comes from, who are Palestinian refugees, kind of who are the people of the Holy Land, which I know because this is also an interfaith space. that's kind of important to tackle. So you can see also from my bio, I worked a lot around Palestinian liberation theology, which was, of course, borrowed from Latin American liberation theology. So if you have any particular questions about that, I'm really happy to answer them. So with that, I think I'm gonna try and share my screen. So maybe Michael, I think it changed the settings when I had to log out. I apologize. So I just have a presentation because I think that pictures and some things written down are just easier. And so why don't you let me know if you can see this? Yeah?
I see it.
Fabulous. Okay. So I'm going to go into presentation mode. Can you still see it?
It's loading, it says. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, here we go. So again, if you have a question, please chat it in. And if I don't see it after a few minutes, maybe just say, hey, and I'll get to it. So this, first of all, perfect. So this is called Demystifying Palestine. And basically what you see here are Palestinians marching to the border of southern Lebanon and Israel in the 2000s. In order to basically demand right of return. There are a lot of different movies around this event, but it was a pretty big deal for the state of Israel at the time because this was one of the major marches where Palestinians were returning to the borders to basically demand return after 70 years, over 3 generations in exile. One of the biggest qualities of the Palestinian struggle and community is that we are largely a refugee population. So Palestinians make up one of the largest refugee populations in the world. And we have a refugee population that's really young. So generally, if you look at different areas of the where Palestinians live today, either in Gaza and the West Bank, within 48 or the state of Israel's borders, and then north in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, you'll see largely a population who is below the age of 15. And so I'll give you some more specific statistics as we go through, just to kind of give you an idea of what our population looks like. So first, tackling kind of the overview of Palestine. So we've done this, and I want you to just think about what are some of the ways that you hear Palestine described today. So think about Palestine, you're coming to this presentation, what are words that you hear? What are things you hear from the news? What are things you hear from other people maybe? And maybe just write them in the chat to give a basic metric kind of, where are we coming into this conversation? And so I'll give you a minute to do that. And as I said, I'm gonna try and give you a brief history in about 20 minutes. And I'll check in and kind of see where you're at. So definitely dangerous, turmoil, settlers, and attacks from settlers. No one's written conflict yet. Okay, dispute, that's a good word. Terrorism. Yeah, keep them coming. Don't be afraid of any issues. It's good to be open with kind of what we're hearing. So yeah, all of what you've written is largely the media discourse in the US. So what's important first is I want to just say, this is where Palestine is. So this is the Middle East, North Africa. And you can see where it says Israel, that is the land of Palestine as well. So when people say, where's Palestine on the map? That's where it is, exactly where Israel's borders are. That is where Palestinians would call Palestine home, or And so what's important is that actually Palestine is the first country on the African continent. So the African continental shelf starts at Palestine and it extends into Egypt, Libya, and into North Africa. But technically, we are also a part of Asia. So we're the land bridge. And that's really, really important because it means that we have tons of people sweeping through. On top of the fact, of course, that Jerusalem is in Palestine or Palestine, and it has the major holy sites for the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And it also is a holy place for the Baha'i religion. So we also have one of the holiest Baha'i temples in Palestine. And so this is kind of what it looks like if you go in, zoom into a map. And what you can see, the orange land is what the state of Israel claims as this is basically the internationally recognized borders. And actually, what Israel claims is their land is the entirety of the orange and like the beigeish color. In international relations terms, what you'll hear in like political science classes is that this area that's beige are the occupied Palestinian territories. So Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then up north, there's a part of Syria that's also occupied, the Golan Heights. My family is from Jaffa, which is a village that is now still there. It's become a neighborhood of Tel Aviv, which is a Jewish-only city, and it's inside of Israel proper. This is an area that I would call 48 because it's the land that was occupied in 1948. I would also call the occupied territories 67 after the time when that was militarily occupied by Israel. So you'll hear different terms, and I think that's part of demystifying this topic. There are many different terms and names for the same place. So when I say historic Palestine, I mean the entire area where that would also be the state of Israel on another map. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why. Are there any questions so far about where we are? Okay. This is a picture I think many of us know, right? So this is the Holy Sepulchre in front of us. Behind is the Dome of the Rock, and you can also see the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. So, and there are many other churches. So you can see the Armenian church, and this is Jerusalem. So this is under Trump, what is now deemed the state of Israel, and it's currently being annexed by the state of Israel. So we can talk about annexation a little bit further on in the presentation. But this is also the cultural, economic, and religious center for Palestinians. And so under international law and the different, let's say the 1947 UN partition plan, Jerusalem is supposed to be an international space that is an international city. So it is not supposed to be annexed as it is currently under the Trump-Kushner plan. So basically, what is Palestine? How was that developed? For those of you who have studied history, most of you have heard about the Ottoman Empire, right? So the Ottoman Empire existed for about 600 years, really, really long withstanding. And Palestine was actually a part of the Ottoman Empire. So we were called Palestine, and we were considered a southern district of Greater Syria. So you can see us right in here, right? Now, during the British Mandate, so basically the Ottoman Empire was a pretty decentralized system. We basically paid taxes to them, and generally, you know, some people came back and forth through Palestine, but they mostly stayed in Istanbul, which was the capital. After World War II, after World War I, in the years preceding World War II, the Ottoman Empire falls. And in that wake, you have the French and British forces come to Palestine, come to Greater Syria, and behind closed doors, create the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So no one in the region, none of the Syrians, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Jordanians were asked, what would you like to happen to your place? What would you like to see happen to, as we're developing nation states in this region? So the Sykes-Picot Agreement basically divvied up Syria and Lebanon under France, and it divvied up something called Transjordan, which later became the Kingdom of Jordan that we see today on a map, and Palestine. So one colonial power took those two states and created the nation state borders that we see today. And the other colonial power, the British, took our region and created the nation states today. And this is pretty common, y'all, right? Because this is just part of the colonialism that was happening at the time all over the world, right? All over Asia, Africa, and of course, the Pacific Islands, right? So Hawaii, etc. We have really similar colonial timelines. So this is really no different. Something that's really important, though, is that in this time, as we fall under the British mandate, there's someone named Lord Balfour. And at the same time, what's happening to the Jewish community in Europe, right? They're being persecuted. There are pogroms that are being set up in Russia. There are, we hear of like ghetto, right? So the Warsaw Ghetto, and different areas that are being set up just for Jewish communities in Germany and in Poland. And so there's major discrimination. And this is, of course, preceding World War II. So Lord Balfour writes this letter to Lord Rothschild, okay, in 1917 as the British mandate is being set up. And he says here that I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's, so England, government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Okay, stop. So one word here that we may not be familiar with is Zionism. You see Jewish Zionist aspirations. Okay, what does that mean? So Zionism at the time, so we're talking about a context where Jews in Europe are being persecuted, right? They're being singled out, and it's the setup for World War II and the Holocaust, right? So before that, there's tons of structural discrimination. So at this time, a Hungarian Jew whose name is Theodor Herzl develops an idea of Zionism. Zionism is a political European ideology to take European Jews and create a national Jewish homeland. So they looked all over the world, and they looked at Ghana, they looked at parts of New Mexico, they looked at Argentina, and they were searching for a place to make a homeland for European Jews as kind of the stakes in Europe became worse and worse. So the problem with this is twofold. One, they were modeling, they're coming from a European system, and basically as colonialism is still like a thriving, active, acceptable method of expanding, the Zionists choose a colonial model. So when they chose Palestine, there was no consideration for the fact that Palestinians already exist there, right? Palestine was seen as a fit place. One, because of the holy connection, the religious connection that Jews have. But the other is also that Europe, Britain in particular, wanted to support the colonization of Palestine because of its geopolitical center. Remember how I told you it's in the center of Africa, Asia, and it's only like 3 countries away from Europe? So it's perfect location, both militarily, for natural resources, etc. The third thing that's important, y'all, is that Britain, Balfour, they were anti-Semitic. That means that they did not want Jews living in Britain. So they're very happy to support a movement that wants to move them to another place, Does that make sense? So what we have as Palestinians is another European decision and diplomacy that's being made without our consideration. Because at this time, as we know a lot about racism, how it progresses, we were seen as colonial subjects, as indigenous people who did not have the mental capacity or trustworthiness to take part in our own diplomacy, right? So this is, excuse my language, but what some people might call a shit show, right? This is a molding issue where we have lots of different things coming to the forefront, right? So let's see. Basically, Lord Balfour is telling Lord Rothschild, look, in the last part of the paragraph, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done with which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So he's saying we will support this state, but not if it displaces non-Jews in the region, which are Palestinians for the most part, even though we do have Palestinian Jews, and I can talk about that later. And it says, look, we are going to support the rights and political status for Jews in another country, which at this time sounds really progressive, considering that Jews are not getting full equal political rights in their own countries of origin, right? Okay, any questions? I know I just said a lot of information, but hopefully it's setting the scene. Yeah, are we good? Okay. So this is just one of the highlights that I have. So establishment of a national home for Jewish peoples. So this is Theodor Herzl. And basically he develops this idea of Zionism, and then he convenes the World Zionist Organization in 1897. And this is in Basel, Switzerland. So from there, before World War II, right, there is en masse immigration of European Jews to Palestine. And they come on very large ships and start to set up Jewish-only villages or settlements inside of the area that we saw as orange, right? So the current state of Israel, these are the beginning kind of pioneers, which what we would say in the US context, who are coming, right? So they're people coming from Europe to settle in Palestine. And that's the important thing. So we talk about colonialism, right? But the US is also a settler colonial state, and so is Israel. So the idea is not that people are coming, like the typical British model, to be the head of another group of people, but they don't really have interest in replacing the population. So let's talk about British India, which is being set up at the same time, right? So the Brits said, okay, everyone here is Indian. We're going to control India. We're going to support a caste system division and create a ruling class that supports our colonial enterprise, but we're going to leave you all there. This is not the same case. The Zionist logic on the basis of Israel, and this is written in the 1920s and many, many early writings, says we want to take European Jews and we want to replace the Palestinian population with them, which means that we as the Palestinians have to get out. Where, there's no answer for, right? And this is the settler colonial aspect of the Israeli state. And it's really important because this is the beginnings of Palestinian exile and refugeehood. And we can see, this is the map, on the right-hand side that shows those Jewish settlements that I just talked about, people coming on ships, setting up camps, all here. And you can see the partition plan for those of you who are in international relations. You can see what the UN decided would be a fair breakdown. I, of course, have issues with it because it's like someone walking into your house and saying, okay, all right, you guys, you get the kitchen and the bathroom, but your visitors get everything else, right? And again, we're not at the table. So this was the UN decision. You can see Jerusalem there in the yellow area. And this is actually what happened here, this third area. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the 1949 to 1967. And here on the right-hand side is the present. The green is the Palestinian land. So remember the map I showed you all that shows the West Bank and the big piece like this? actually, the way what Sunny talked about as settlements, when you zoom in, this is actually what it looks like. So you have Israeli settlements in the West Bank that are set up to bifurcate Palestinian villages from one another. That means that we in Palestine cannot move from one village to another without crossing through an Israeli checkpoint. And this is intentional because the point actually is to push Palestinians. It's called a full transfer plan if you want to do more research. Full transfer. So fully transfer Palestinians from our homes into the surrounding countries. So this is British mandate to zoom in. Remember, we have the French, we have the British in Iraq, Transjordan and Palestine, and then we have Lebanon and Syria here, the French. What happens? This is what it looks like under British control. And basically, the Palestinians are not so happy about this, right? So the British only last maybe 30 years, right? And before there's the Great Arab Revolt, that's what it's called. So in 1936 to 1939, Palestinians participated in one of the largest boycotts, most successful and longest boycotts for 7 months in the history of the modern era. So basically in response to the influx of European Jews into Palestine to create settlements, right, to stay, and the British basically making backdoor deals and taking economic control of Palestine, the Palestinians revolted and they made demands. And you're talking about every single sector of Palestinian society shut down for 7 months. So we shut down the ports, we shut down the railroad, we shut down all construction because Palestinians were used for labor, right? So we are building this place. So without our labor, the British were not able to continue to control Palestine and build Palestine. So instead, they were very clever and they brought in more foreign labor in the form of European Jewish labor, right? To try and undercut our control and the boycott. So when we talk about the UN partition plan, we have the 1947 partition plan, which gives the Jewish state, the state of Israel, 56% of the land, and gives the Arab state, they call it Jewish and Arab. I don't like that terminology because there are lots of Arab Jews. The largest population of Jews in the world are Arab from other surrounding areas. So I like to say Israeli and Palestinian, but anyways, that's another point. But the important thing is that the majority of the people there, of course, are Palestinians, but we're getting 43% of the land under the UN partition plan. In a way, it didn't really matter because when 1948 transpired, and this is what, you know how we have like Thanksgiving, right? So here we have Thanksgiving, right? And that is a celebration that, you know, every quote unquote American household celebrates around the peace agreements with the Pequot and the sitting down of indigenous and white settlers at a table, right? But that's not a celebration for everybody, right? So for the indigenous communities in the United States, that is a time of mourning and remembrance, right? The same kind of thing happens here. So whereas Israelis will call this, and Zionist supporters will call 1948 Israeli Independence Day in May, we call it the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. This is the time when over 50% of our people were expelled in the series of a few months. So my grandparents are survivors of the Nakba, and we were, it's complicated, right? Because we were pushed out by Jewish Europeans, many of whom had just survived the Holocaust, right? So as the Holocaust is happening, and after the liberation of Belsen and other camps, many Jews in Europe actually wanted to come to the United States. And this is important because this is the history we're not told. The majority wanted to come to the US and Britain. And the US and Britain had anti-Semitic policies at the time. They did not want Jewish immigration. So what did they do? They pushed them to the newly developed state of Israel. So there are boats that are being turned around from New York Harbor and from areas, the ports like Dover in the UK, and they're being shipped and dropped off in Palestine, in the Middle East, right? Those same folks fought a war of aggression, I would call it, or they would say a war of independence, and basically made the Israeli state a reality on the ground by displacing Palestinians. So you can see, tents here on the left-hand side. So many of the places where we ended up in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and the West Bank and Gaza, we set up tents in order to wait out 1 week, 2 weeks with the idea that we would return home. I'm here today as a granddaughter of people like this because I'm telling you that over 70 years, so 3 generations, we still haven't returned. So those camps, those tents have become houses, they've become apartments, they've become refugee camps. Still, without the infrastructure that is necessary to live there for a long time, because we're still, again, in international law, all of the laws that surround the Palestinian issue, refugee issue, are temporary. They're for a temporary situation. We're protracted refugees. So 70 years later, we're still living under a legal system that was supposed to be set up for 2 years, 3 years, and we're still there, right? So just to jump, there's a lot of history that happens in between 48 and 67, but I want to be cognizant of the time and get to the 2000s. So here we have the Nexa, and this is important because whereas before, basically, State of Israel is created within the borders that are orange, and Jordan controls the West Bank, and Egypt controls the Gaza Strip. In 1967, there's another 6-day war, and Israel militarily occupies the West Bank and Gaza, and they take part of southern Syria, which is the Golan Heights. This is also where Israel takes full control of Jerusalem. So whereas before you have West Jerusalem, which is Jewish Israeli, and you have East Jerusalem, which is Palestinian, now Israel takes control of both sides of Jerusalem. And if you go to Jerusalem today, you will see that it looks like a very different town. So it looks like what we might say in the US is another side of the tracks, right? Which shows that there are people who are living in the same society, but living in totally different material conditions and realities, right? And I'll show you some examples of the difference between Israeli and Palestinian infrastructure in the same city. First, this is maybe in the 1970s, definitely, but also in 1993, these are where some of the tropes that you all brought up about terrorism come from. So, you know, when you hear about Palestinian suicide bombers and, you know, youth with knives or stones, some of this stuff, this is where it comes from. So I skipped over the slide that talks about the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but just to say the importance of that is Palestinians in different places all around the world created a government with different unions and representatives that were supposed to represent us at the international level, right? Basically, in 1993, you have this really, starts in 1987, where you have a Palestinian population who are underpaid, they are brutalized by a military occupation, their families have been separated from one another, and you have mass incarceration of Palestinian males. So 40% of the Palestinian male population is either currently incarcerated or has been incarcerated in their lifetime. So people are fed up, right? And you have an uprising. So intifada means to shake it off, to shake off the oppression, basically. And this was catalyzed by mass popular movements. And it was pretty amazing because, yes, Palestinians did rise up using stones and other methods of resistance. But what you see is the power that Palestinians were up against, which is the Israeli military force that is funded by the United States, right? And so this is really important because right after the Intifada, where you see, lots of people uprising and reacting particularly to the past 10 years of oppression, you have the Oslo Accords. Have folks heard about the Oslo Accords? No? Yeah? So this is important because basically you see Clinton and you see Arafat and you see Rabin, and the idea of the Oslo Accords from the Clinton administration was to solve the conflict. So to say, okay, this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, two equal parties that are going to come to the table and agree for peace, right? But what does peace mean if there isn't justice? So the Palestinian civil society groups did not support this because through this agreement, we had nothing to gain. And here's the problem with that framing for me. Israel and Palestine are not two equal forces that are both fighting for the same land. You have a highly well-funded and highly well-resourced military against a popular Palestinian movement, right? So you have people against a military occupation. So we would never say that the Nigerians and the British, for example, during the anti-colonial movement in Nigeria, were equal partners, right? In that case, obviously, Britain is the colonizing force. And this is the same thing here, where Israel is a colonial state, but like I said, it's filled with people who are coming from persecution, right? From Europe. And it was supported by Britain and other European states and the United States, who didn't want Jews within their country, right? So this, honestly, was an agreement on paper where Palestinians are supposed to have a state within 7 years of the agreement. Otherwise, it dissolves. We are in 2020, and the Oslo Accords are still signed. They're still ratified. These are still the accords that we're living under. So it's a false promise of peace because there's no justice and there's nothing written about the millions of Palestinians who are living under occupation or who are secondary citizens within Israel and living under a legal apartheid. So the Palestinians that remained within the Orange area, like my family, they are second-class citizens in their own village. We can't own the house that we live in. And there are 50 laws that don't apply to us, even though we're living in the exact same society. So whether it's occupation or apartheid, there are legal ramifications basically for being Palestinian on the land and for being refugees. I'm almost done with the history, and then I'm gonna stop for some questions and get into some framing. So let's, I'll try and end in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So this is the Second Intifada. Most of us, I think, have heard of the Second Intifada, right? So this one is really a reaction to more staunch military control and the Oslo Accords, which have brought no positive change for Palestinians on the ground. I can't think of a single thing that improved. And you also have at this point an economic de-development. So again, another political science term. You have an economic hardship, for example. De-development is literally the de-development of the Palestinian job, infrastructure, export and import, and general economic well-being. So you have Palestinians who can't find work, and you also have the Israeli control of all economic sectors. And you also have the Palestinian labor, which is making up the majority of certain Israeli economic sectors. So we are now working for the Israeli state but most of the money is not going back to our communities. And that's important because here, remember how I told you a lot of Palestinian refugee populations are really young? You basically have a class of youth who don't have any opportunities. And they're seeing a political problem, right, which cannot be solved through humanitarian aid. So whereas more people are reacting and saying, wow, Palestinians are living in poverty, we're gonna give them more food, we're gonna try and offer fresh water, we're gonna try and offer medical support. Yes, people in Gaza, for example, or Jerusalem are living below the poverty line and they're hungry, but that doesn't solve the issue that we're facing, which is that we're living without dignity. So we're living in areas where we're living in Jerusalem where Palestinian areas don't have services. We don't have trash pickup, right? We don't have our own public services. And we don't have any semblance of being able to have self-determination, right? And so this is kind of where the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call comes in. And this is a call from Palestinian civil society in 2005 to basically follow the same or a similar model that was used in the South African apartheid struggle, right? So the Polaroid campaign, are folks familiar with that generally? I definitely suggest you look it up if you're interested. So the Polaroid campaign is a really famous boycott campaign from South Africa. And this is Palestinians trying to utilize a model. So they're saying, okay, international corporations, if you all are operating within the Palestinian territories, or you are abusing Palestinian resources and people and supporting Israeli apartheid and occupation and making money from this situation, we will boycott you in order to hold you to a higher standard, okay? And the same can be said for divestment. So this is where you have really big campaigns against Hewlett-Packard. So Hewlett-Packard Enterprises is actually the main outsourcer for the prison database in California, okay? So if you want to look up your loved one who's incarcerated, or look at if the prison system wants to transfer someone who's incarcerated from one place to another, they use the Hewlett-Packard database and system. Hewlett-Packard is making money off of incarceration in California, and that's not cool, right? That's not just. But because it works so well in the California prison system, they actually applied that same system to Israel. So Palestinian prisoners are also tracked and transferred, and the data is held through Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. And the campaign against Hewlett-Packard, which was a local campaign where their shareholders meet in San Jose, was so successful that Hewlett-Packard recently divided itself. So in order to avoid being held accountable by consumers, they split into Hewlett-Packard Enterprises and Hewlett-Packard Inc. And Hewlett-Packard Inc. is the thing that sells your printers and your computers, and Hewlett-Packard Enterprises does everything else. So now, even if we boycott printers and TVs, it won't affect the bottom line for the stuff that they're really making money off of, which is prisons and incarceration. So I'm gonna pause here for a moment and just get some basic questions, like how are we feeling in terms of the clarity of information? Can I get maybe a vibe check or a temperature check? So thumbs up, I'm pretty clear on how we got here. Middle, I still have some basic questions, or thumbs down, you really lost me. I don't know how we got here. Yeah, and don't be shy. If it doesn't make sense, let me know. Sort of? Okay, cool. Great. So basically, I said frames of Palestine. How are we talking about it? So the major thing that you're hearing is conflict, right? Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Are folks clear on why I'm not a fan of that terminology? Because there's no substance, right? It doesn't say how we got here. It doesn't say conflict from who, right? And it also shows that we're two people with the same power, the same effect, the same capacity for violence. And I'm saying, no, we have a diametric power relationship. You have oppressor and oppressed, right? And that's just because of the military power. That's because of the support and the relationship of Israel as a colonial state to the present. So we have a colonial struggle that's happening in 2020, whereas many, many places in the world were granted independence, and they fought for their independence across African continent and Asian continent and Latin America. You have Palestine, which still has not reached that apex, right? Church joined the HP. Oh, awesome. That's awesome. Yes, the HP boycott is still ongoing. It's still really important, but we had to change our tactics when they diversified, right? So is most of Palestine refugees. Okay, so yes, Christina, most Palestinians are refugees. We have still about 50% of the Palestinian population living inside of Palestine. So that means 50% are living outside. But here's the secret, right? Inside of Palestine, most Palestinians are refugees, which means that they're not living on the land that they come from. According to the United Nations, only 12% of Palestinians live either in or within 2 kilometers of their village. Most people are much farther away. Any other questions, please?
Could I ask you to talk just a little bit about the fact that there are refugee camps within Palestine?
Yes.
Not
yes.
just outside.
Yes, absolutely. So there are Palestinians within refugee camps, as we talked about in Lebanon and in Syria. They're very famous. But yes, we overlook the fact that there are Palestinian refugee camps in Palestine. So Bethlehem, which we know as a really holy city, has 3 refugee camps. Those refugee camps, for example, like Dheisheh, is only 1 square mile. And whereas it may have started with, 70 families, now it has many, many, many people. I actually don't know the population of Dheisheh, but within 1 square mile, you have, let me look it up actually, so I can give you the correct idea. But the idea is that basically from tents to now permanent infrastructure, you have 1 square mile of a Palestinian establishment, refugee establishment, which they have nowhere to go. They're busting at the seams, right?
Well, just when you're looking it up, I can just add on. But when I was there, we slept a night in the refugee camp. Where you're talking about, and Israeli military was there every night arresting people. Mm-hmm. They were running raids into. So that even where I was at, we had to keep all the windows closed, even if that was hot in the summer, because of the tear gas coming in, and we were woken up in the middle of the night by hearing the gunshots and the tear gas canisters being fired all over in the refugee camp. But that's a nightly thing. And the day after we were there, we found out that one of the hosts that we stayed with was arrested. Because of being a teenager, because they accused him of throwing rocks at the tank. So it was interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Sunny. Yeah. I mean, and please give more of your experience too. I think it's pretty interesting. Dr. Angela Davis talks often about her relationship to the Palestinian struggle, not only because she was a political prisoner and wrote to Palestinian political prisoners during her time in jail, but also because she talks about growing up in the South and the civil rights movement, and how when we look at civil rights protests by Black Americans in the South against intense state supremacy and white supremacy movements, at the time there was a conversation, or let's say a media framing of 2 sides right, who were fighting and battling with one another. Now, much removed from that context, many of us who are progressive would say the civil rights movement were a group of people who are oppressed by the state, revolting against the state and demanding equal rights. And so she says when she sees Palestinian kids throwing rocks at tanks, right, what she sees is the diametric power, right, a big military power against a civilian population. And that is not to say also maybe some of you will hear like think about bombings of Gaza and think, okay, often I get this question, what about Hamas, right? What about Hamas as an armed, having an armed political wing? I can also go more into that, but the point is that for the majority, the Palestinian population is not armed, and this is a popular revolt, the demands of which I can go through. Anything else from folks? Am I missing a question? Sorry, let me see.
Yeah.
Could I discuss 1967? Is that your question, Michael?
Yeah, that was my question. Could you like discuss that one more time, please?
Yes, absolutely. So in 1967, let me go back to the slide. The Nakba. So this is important because it's the date when Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza are taken under Israeli military control. So this is the point where Israel takes control of the 1948 territories, and this is where they expand, right?
But this is where also history is just covered as a 6-day war.
Yes, it's covered as a 6-day war because the dominant narrative is that all the Arab countries amassed, and they wanted to fight Israel, to take Israel on, and Israel miraculously defeated the countries, the Arab countries, or the Arab aggression of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. What we don't hear is that Israel has a qualitative military edge in the Middle East. So the US has an agreement, and they say that they will only sell the best military equipment to Israel. Every other country in the region will have secondary military equipment. So the Egyptian planes that Israel talks about, oh, they're bombing, right? The Egyptian planes never took off the ground because the US had the codes to the maps that the planes had. So they were bombed by Israeli fighter jets before they left the ground. There are also backdoor deals that Israel and the United States made with different Arab forces. So it's not as straightforward as that story might say, right? But what's important is the result of this was that Israel militarily occupied these regions. So the occupied Palestinian territories are referred to as the 1967 territories, the territories that were taken by Israel at the time. And I don't know, do you have any other specific questions, Michael?
No, I was just going to just one more time because
yeah. No, it's a lot. And I think if we look at what it means to live as a Palestinian in that area today, you are living under military law. So Israel, for example, they have a civilian court for Israelis who are living in the occupied territories in the settlements that we talked about earlier, and I'll show you some photos. But for Palestinians living in those territories, we don't have civilian law. We have military law, which means that we don't have the right to a fair trial. We don't have the right to a jury. That is not a military jury. The judge is a military judge, and the rulings are in a language that we don't speak, which is Hebrew. So you have these trials that are going forward in like 10 minutes, which is why the conviction rate of Palestinians under Israeli military court is 99.7%. It's one of the highest conviction rates in the world because there is no trial. So for example, if we look at conflict, let's just break that down. So say that there is a conflict between an Israeli child and a Palestinian child in the West Bank. And it gets picked up by the police. That Israeli child from the settlement will go to Israeli civilian court. The Palestinian child will go through his military court. So Israel also has a court, a military court for children, and they're the only country in the world that has a juvenile military court. Many countries have military courts for adults, right? They're the only one that has one for children. So we have also military court and high incarceration for Palestinian children. And that's important because it means that we as Palestinians are combatants. We're deemed combatants under Israeli military law from the minute we're born to the minute we die, regardless of what we do. And Palestinian children are deemed as adults under this system once they turn 15 and a half. So also, it's a little bit confusing because Palestinians, depending on where we are and where we're registered, the color card that we have different laws that apply to us. So my family that lives in Israel, or what I would call in 1948, historic Palestine, in our village, they hold Israeli citizenship, but they do not have the same rights as Jewish Israelis. They are second-class citizens, right? And so that would be an apartheid system, which is what we saw in South Africa, where you have two groups of people that are in the same nation and they're neighbors and they live in the same context, but they have two completely different set of laws that apply to them. So whereas you have Palestinians in 67, so in Gaza and the West Bank, who have occupation and military law, in those who are living in Jerusalem, parts of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem is a little complicated. It kind of goes under the military law frame. You have Palestinians living in 48 who are under Israeli civilian law, but they are under an apartheid law. So they do not have the same rights and access as Palestinians. Does that make sense?
I think
Okay.
if you can help explain that parts of all of the Israel is separated out into different, there's under the Israeli control, we're dual control and just Palestinian control. I think that's all different.
Right. So here, again, you have the direct Israeli state is under, is the orange area. These areas, the beige areas, are also under Israeli control. But it's an Israeli military control. Sunny, you talked about Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority is set up by Oslo in 93. But
Right.
Here's the deal. You have 8 layers of law and of courts in the beige area. The first layer for Area A, which Area A are the big Palestinian cities, which are Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem, and Hebron. Okay. In those areas, Area A, which is supposed to be Palestinian jurisdiction, the first level of law or the first court system for Palestinians is Palestinian, all Palestinian. The second is half Palestinian, half Israeli. And layers 3 through 8 are all Israeli military. Areas B, which are the smaller areas outside of Bethlehem, Ramallah, Hebron, and Nablus, are mixed territory. Every layer of law there is Israeli military. Area C is the entire area along the river, because this is where fresh water is. You can imagine in a desert environment, water is a really big issue, right? So Israel actually has Area C, which is a closed military zone, all along the border here. So we talk about annexation today under the Trump and Kushner plan. We're talking about the official annexation of 95% of the most fertile land in Palestine, which is the land along the river. And that's really important because the other point is that the Israeli military has the power to designate any area as a closed military zone. So they can designate Area A as Area C temporarily in order to carry out a military operation, which pulls Palestinians, for example, from their beds in the middle of the night. Area B, so if we've seen Has anyone seen 5 Broken Cameras? That's a really good movie. I can write it in the chat. So the village of Belin, or you can also look up the movie Budros. So those villages are Area B, which means that when the Israeli military comes into those areas that are largely along the wall, they can dictate this area is now Area C, which means that Palestinians are not allowed to be there. But these Palestinians live there, that's their village, that's their home. So Palestinians temporarily under that jurisdiction become squatters in their own homes, which legally makes Israel allowed, basically permits them under their laws to invade the area. And that happens all the time when we look at the cases of Hebron, for example, which have one of the highest incarceration of Palestinian people and children. And they also have the most kind of intense and conservative settlers. So that's the basic idea kind of the legal breakdown. This is a slide that I'm happy to send y'all if you want to look more at kind of what BDS is. So boycott involved withdrawing support for Israel and Israeli international companies that are involved in the violation of Palestinian human rights, as well as complicit in Israeli sporting, cultural, and academic institutions. And then there's divestment. Divestment campaigns urge banks, local councils, churches like yours, and pension funds and universities to withdraw investment, saying we should not put our money towards projects of violence, right? And to support and to invest in these institutions is not neutral. It's actually supporting violence. The neutral thing is to remove your funds, right? And then sanctions we haven't got to, but it's the campaign to pressure governments to fulfill their legal obligation to hold Israel to account. So we're saying, okay, there's a set of international laws, right? Israel is not complying with those international laws. There are active human rights violations happening against the Palestinian people. So we as an international community want to hold Israel accountable to an international legal structure. That's where sanctions comes in. So the Palestinian call, the civil society call, says we representatives of Palestinian civil society call upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. We appeal to you to pressure your respective states to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel. And we also invite conscientious Israelis to support this call for the sake of justice and genuine peace. So this is a call to the table. And I won't go through all of these demands, but this is an Israeli watchtower. This is the 1.0. You all maybe saw under the Trump presidency that Elbit Systems has received the grant or received the contract to build Trump's section of the wall along the US-Mexico border. You see this infrastructure here. Israeli company, Elbit, won that contract because they have years and years of military application or field testing in Palestine. So they're going to build a 2.0 version of this tower that you see here. And they already are along the Autumn Native Reservation. They're building 22 towers. The second is we are heavily policed within where we are incarcerated at a 40% rate, and we're heavily policed within the Israeli system. So there's a call for us to actually receive fair trial and equality, our fundamental rights, which is the rights to move, right? Palestinians also in the West Bank should have the right to move, the right to freedom of movement within their area. So not to be constricted.
Go back to the picture.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just point out, in this George Floyd era, the picture shows a knee on the back of the neck. That's symbolic. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't miss that.
No, it's important actually. And Sunny, it's great that you pointed out, it's more than symbolic because One of the exports that Israel has around the world is military training. So I'm in the Bay Area, and we had something called Urban Shield, which was the military training of US police forces.
Right.
It was one of the largest in the world, and it took place every year. So the Israeli military came, along with other international militaries who have plenty of human rights violations, like the Filipino National Military, or the Honduran National Military. And they came and they trained local police forces on anti-terrorism. And so, yes, I don't know where the tactics of the different police departments come from exactly, but we do see a knee on the neck through Israeli military practice. That study hasn't been done yet, but I would not be surprised if it's a training from the Israeli military. There are many, many other things we see that are. Here we have the right of return. So there are lots of Palestinians, like I said, who are refugees. We actually have an international right to return, which is Resolution 194. And so these are the children of refugees who are refugees themselves, who are marching back to the Israeli border to say, we want to go home. I talked to you all about infrastructure. Go ahead, Sunny.
I think you need to, can you talk a little more about how right now Palestinians cannot go back to Palestine?
Yeah, so let's say that Palestinians in Lebanon want to go back to visit an uncle or an aunt who's living in another area. So they're registered in a different area. They are not able to travel outside of their area of jurisdiction. So they can't. They're not allowed to return. For Palestinians, even if you have Israeli citizenship, in Palestine, because Lebanon is qualified as an unfriendly or an enemy state by the state of Israel, they cannot actually go to Lebanon and return without consequences by the state of Israel. So Palestinians are fundamentally separated and fragmented from being able to see each other. When I go to Palestine as an American citizen, if I have a hawiyya or a registration in the West Bank, this is very rare. This doesn't happen anywhere else. I am not allowed to travel like an American citizen. I can only travel within the West Bank. So the Israeli jurisdiction will apply to me, not as an American, as a Palestinian. For me, because my parents are not registered and my father is a refugee, I have American citizenship. They don't have to let me in, and they often give me a hard time. But once I am in, so long as they don't put any other restrictions on me, I am allowed to travel. But when I see my family, I'm allowed to see family who live 10 minutes from each other in different jurisdictions who haven't seen each other in years, right? So imagine being so close, because the area is not that big. So imagine being separated and not being able to see each other because they're not allowed to cross the wall. And on top of that, we have different jurisdictions. So this is an Israeli road on the right-hand side that's really well paved, has lights, has a barrier in the middle. And I swear to you, this is a Palestinian road. So there's an Israeli road system where Israelis are allowed to travel and Palestinians are not allowed to travel on the same roads. It's punishable by imprisonment. So you can imagine in the winter what this road looks like. It doesn't look very good at this moment, but you can imagine how long it takes to get from one place to another. And on top of that, Palestinians are subjected to Israeli military checkpoints. This is, I'll come back to the settlement, but this is the wall, right? So you see pictures of the Berlin Wall. This is what the wall looks like. This is going to separate Palestinians, Palestinian areas from Israeli areas, but sometimes actually it completely circumvents an area. So let me show you the village of Kalkilia. This is a village of Kalkilia. This is a Palestinian village. You see the wall? The wall goes all the way around Kalkilia. This is a form of intimidation. So Kalkilia is extremely fertile. has a lot of water, and Israel wants to take the land, right? But they can't directly. So instead, they have completely circled the village of Kalkilia, and here in the middle, they have a checkpoint, right? So they want to basically restrict access to jobs. So instead of going back and forth every day, people from Kalkilia will stay outside of Kalkilia and work, and then on the weekends try to come home, right? And they're restricting basically the ability to live there, right? So it's not as simple. When we hear from the media wall, a lot of people think it's like a straight line. Not at all. The wall snakes. And it's not along the green line or in the international line of partition. It goes far, far, far into Palestinian territories in order to basically take water. So, and look, right here, Ras Aliyah, right here, that area is another Palestinian village, but the wall separates Palestinian villages from each other. So what's the logic there? If it's only supposed to separate Palestinians and Israelis, why is it separating Palestinian villages from each other? And here we see a settlement. So really, the idea is to be able to give the settlement, the Israeli settlement, so I'll go back to that picture now, space to expand, right? But to restrict the Palestinians from expanding. So this is a settlement. You can tell that it's an Israeli settlement for two reasons. One is the red roofs, which are very symbolic of Europe, right? So you have a lot of European infrastructure. And the second is running water. So settlements have running water to and from, right? If you turn on the tap, you have running water. Palestinian villages, you can actually see Palestinian houses. Can you see my, here, let me get my pointer out.
Yeah,
Here, you see
right?
this here on
Yep.
the bottom right? That is a Palestinian house. And you can tell because it has a black water tank. And I'll show you a few more pictures. So Palestinian houses in the West Bank do not have running water. They have a water tank on the top, which must be filled every month. But the Israeli military routinely, and this is what Amnesty International often does their research on for folks who are interested in international human rights reports. Amnesty International often reports on water scarcity or water apartheid within Palestine because it's such a big issue. So for punishment of the people of Kalkilia, for example, sometimes their water will not be filled for 4 months at a time, right? And for every person, every Israeli settler who lives in a settlement, they use 51 times more water than one Palestinian, okay? So up here, y'all, you have swimming pools, you have chlorinated, there's this very modern concert park in Mali Adomim that has water and an island in the middle. And the people who live down below, who are part of the Jahalin Bedouin tribe, they aren't even allowed to build permanent infrastructure like schools for their families. And there's no water. So you have a really, really serious difference and disparity in populations. Look at this, living right next to each other, right? Any questions? I know I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk. But I did want to just say there are plenty of active campaigns. And so you can look up stuff around SodaStream or CAT. You can look up musicians who have not gone to perform in Israel because of the apartheid. And this is what a checkpoint looks like. So these are Palestinians waiting in the morning to go to work. They're on one side of the checkpoint trying to enter the other side. This is something that Israelis are not subjected to. This is just a Palestinian system. And the people operating these checkpoints are Israeli military. On the left-hand side, you have all of the checkpoints in the West Bank. So you have over 600 checkpoints that exist that bifurcate Palestinians and subject us to restriction of movement, which is illegal under international law, but it still happens, right? This is the wall. I won't go into the bombing of Gaza, but I am happy to talk more about collective punishment. I do want to talk about Great March of Return, the same way that we see Palestinians coming to the border in Lebanon. We see Palestinians in Gaza who marched to the wall and basically demanded return to their villages. 2/3 of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees from somewhere else. 100% of the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering a major political crisis and a major humanitarian crisis. Majority of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. And when we talk about the percentages, we have 2 million people living in a strip that's 26 by 8 miles wide. 2 million people, and 50% of them are under the age of 15. So you have 1 million children and 1 million everybody else, right? No freedom of movement, no access to be able to leave. With the Egyptian military regime, they're restricted by Egypt, and on either side, they're restricted by Israel. They're not allowed to fish more than 3 kilometers out into the water. They have major, major restriction. There's no airport, nothing, right? I show the picture up here on the right-hand side of Palestinian men with one of their legs missing, because this is another Israeli military tactic, which is the shooting of Palestinians in a nerve that's right below the kneecap in order to cause amputation and maiming of the civilian population. So often we talk about, okay, how many people have died in a conflict? And that's important. But Israel's tactic is also to maim. So how many Palestinians are made disabled by the clashes? And that's also really, really important, because it's a huge population, and men and women can both work, but we know that in many cases, men are the workforce for industrial jobs. And so these are also breadwinners for their families who now are unable to work. Down below, we have the medic, Dazen Najjar, who was shot and killed as a field medic by Israeli military. She's someone who I look up to. I think she's an amazing woman. She was 21 years old when she was killed by the Israeli military, and she was killed in a medic's vest. So this is an example of how Israel also targets humanitarian workers within Palestinian society. I think I will end here, but does anyone remember this picture from the Syrian Revolution? This one here. So this is, yeah, do folks remember? This is the this is the refugee camp of Yarmouk. So the refugee camp of Yarmouk was one of the largest Palestinian refugee camps in the world. So these are many, many, many Palestinians, hundreds of thousands, who were refugees from Palestine to Syria, and now they're refugees again from Syria to other parts of the world. And so you have a protracted, ongoing refugee population. So our call to action, what do we do, is to really address the US and Israel relationship as people who are living in the US, whether residents or citizens, to really hold accountable the US government and the Israeli government, boycott, divestment, sanctions, to participate in nonviolent direct action against companies and institutions that are profiting off of violence, cross-movement building to build with one another, to build with other populations who are experiencing similar violence. So we've done some really good work building with indigenous communities along the border. We need to do more to support them, but they are basically up against Israeli infrastructure that we know a lot about as Palestinians, and who is being funded by the US government, and also to support Palestinian organizing. So I'm part of a Palestinian collective. We support our youth who might feel hopeless in these situations, but to really talk about our power and to educate each other on where we come from, to give each other hope, and to create community in a situation where our families are suffering, and many times we're suffering from this legacy of violence that we've inherited. And so 30 years ago, the UC divested from South Africa. It's a really cool history. And UC campuses, are divesting en masse from Israeli corporations, from fossil fuels, from private prisons, right? These are the moves to try and hold our institutions accountable for the money, where they're investing their money, where their money goes, right? And this is a divestment resolution passing at UCLA, which I know is not USC, but is a nearby example. It's what I could think of. So I'll stop there. I know that it was quite a long presentation. I want to make sure to get to some of your questions in the time that we have, and maybe ask if it was okay to go about 5 minutes over, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Okay.
Anyone have any questions for Nadya? What do you think? Your comments as well as what you have heard. Let's have a conversation. Everybody unmute. You too, Nadya.
Okay, I'm here.
Let's see
Don't
where
worry,
everybody's
I'm here.
at. So what do you think? What you've heard? So let me ask the first question then. You tell me, Nadya, if it's all the court system and everything else is, it's all run by the Israeli military, would you consider Palestinians are being essentially considered as a POW in Palestine by Israel?
Yeah, I think so. I think because we don't have access, so the idea of like habeas corpus, right? You're innocent before being proven guilty. We don't have that, right? We don't have the right to remain silent, right? Some of the Miranda laws that we have here in the U.S. that you're supposed to have. Of course, we know there's structural inequalities in our prison system, but those laws are in place. In Israel, there's no like facade of those laws. They don't exist. So we have many Palestinian detainees who are held in administrative detention, which is actually something we inherited from the British. The Israelis have been using the British system, which means that we as Palestinians can be held in prison indefinitely without any access to our files. So we don't know, and sometimes our lawyers also don't know what we've been accused of. So it's a completely unjust system. So whereas here we have a really messed up and problematic prison system and legal system, there's a facade of equal rights. There, we don't have it. Not in the occupied Palestinian territories. Good question, Marika. So in terms of religious oppression, are Palestinian peoples of faith denied access to holy sites and places of worship in the region? Right. So yes and no. So my family is Christian, and my family who live in Bethlehem are not allowed often to cross into Jerusalem for Easter. So it's literally a 20-minute drive, and they can't access the Holy Sepulchre. And that's really important because there are many Christians around the world who have a religious connection, but we are the Christians who steward the churches. So we're literally the ones who are cleaning the church, these super holy sites, we're the ones taking care of them. My pastor, or we would say like our priest, our abuna, in San Francisco is a Palestinian pastor who was actually denied, he was supposed to be at the Church of the Nativity, and he was denied access to the Church of the Nativity and to his post by Israel. So he actually came to San Francisco to be our priest. He finally was allowed, he was permitted after 10 years of trying to go back to his post. So now he is a priest at the Church of Nativity. For Palestinian Muslims, who are the majority of our population, they are often denied access to their holy sites. And there is a lot of clashes. The Second Intifada is a great example between Israeli military and Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa. Part of that is because there's a very conservative Jewish sect that's also supported by some of the famous like US evangelical movements. So like Jerry Falwell or Oral Roberts, right? Are these ringing a bell? Right? Like the televangelists who support the destruction of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, in order to resurrect and rebuild a Jewish temple. And so there are many times visits from Israeli settlers supported and protected by Israeli military who come in and out of the compound. So yes, unfortunately, there is religious kind of fragmentation as well.
Do you understand, do all of you understand why conservative Christians are doing that? It's not that they favor, it's not that they favor Judaism.
No.
Because conservative Christianity considers Judaism an enemy, you know, which is silly, but because it's their belief in reading the Revelation. So once they put the temple back in, then Jesus will return. That'll bring up at the end time. That's what they are working for. And so they say the only thing that's keeping the end time is that the Allah, the mosque that's there. So that's why the conservatives.
And that's also why, yes, and there's also why, you know, the largest pro-Israel lobby in the US is actually not AIPAC, it's CUFI. So it's the Christians United for Israel, because they also believe that if once Jerusalem reaches majority Israeli Jews as residents, that will prompt the return of Jesus. So they're also involved in a political game in order to prompt the return of Jesus Christ, or the second coming. And Israel, of course, knows that many of these churches, like you said, Sunny, are actually anti-Semitic, right? They believe fundamentally that Jews, other than 44,000 who are saved, will burn in hell. And they know that, but they are banking on the fact that that second return of Christ won't happen. So these forces are also using each other to get to a similar means or a similar end. Which is why you have white supremacists supporting the state of Israel, even though a lot of them are anti-Jewish, right? It's a really weird relationship. What is the Israeli perspective? Do citizens support Palestinian freedom? It's a good question. So there are progressive movements within Israel, but there are not very many, and I'll tell you why. Historically, we've had some pretty notable like anti-war movements within Israel, but over time, as the situation has become worse and the state has become more and more conservative, many of these progressive Israelis are actually moving. So I know pretty active Israeli activists, a lot of them end up outside of Israel because they just can't stand it anymore. And the second thing that we have to talk about is military conscription. So every Israeli citizen, other than Orthodox Jews, certain sect who are like exceptional, they don't serve in the Israeli military. Every single Israeli, Jewish Israeli, serves in the military. So every single one serves in the occupation. Men and women serve in the occupation of Palestine. And that's important because where you do have refusnik movements, like the Shminitsim, who are the 12ers or the 12th graders, who refuse to serve. They have to serve prison time most of the time in order to do that. Or you have breaking the silence, which are Israeli military soldiers who have ended their military service and then speak out and say, this is not right. Those are not central movements. They're still pretty rare because another point that's important is that Israeli military service is favorable when trying to get a job. So if you apply to be a music teacher in Israel, you have like a one-page write-up about becoming a music teacher and why you're qualified. And then you have another write-up on your Israeli military service. That's for any job. So if you don't have Israeli military service to tote, the ability for you to be hired is very, very low. You see, so you have to take a big economic hit and risk in order to do that. And that's why there aren't as many movements. But another really good movie is Naila and the Uprisings. I'm gonna write it down. Please, please watch it. It's one of my favorite movies. It goes into some of the stuff that you were asking about, Michael, in 1967. The other one is The Wanted 18, which goes into the Second Intifada. It's really fun. It follows a group of cows that Palestinians bought 18 cows in order to sustain themselves during the revolution so that they didn't have to buy Israeli products. And the Israeli military knew that the cows were subsisting Beit Sahur, and so they went after the cows. So Beit Sahur actually had to hide 18 cows from the Israeli military. And it's a really good movie. It's a lot of fun, but it has real history. And it also interviews Israeli activists. So same thing with Naila. It talks about the women's movement in Israel who supported Palestinian political prisoners and women in particular. It is not, unfortunately, I'll tell you again, it is not a central movement. It's not very popular, but of course there are people who exist.
Well, and also, what I saw when I was there was the Israeli government using like Druze, and the minority groups, and Christians on the front lines against doing the dangerous and oppressive work against the Palestinians themselves, because there is other minority group. Is it the minority group is what?
The Druze.
Druze, and so they are, so they are the minority group, but they are, not Christians. So they're more the indigenous group and religious religion. And those are the ones that are put in the front line. So when I was there last time, there was a protest at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the ones who are in the front lines doing all the standing up against the protest, against the lack of a better word, Arab or Palestinian protesters were the Druze and other Christians and so on. The Jewish soldiers were not on the front lines. they were, so it was the ones who were minority and who were asked to do the quote unquote the dirty work or the dangerous work.
Yeah, and that's important because their lives are seen as less valuable. So if a Jewish Israeli soldier dies in clashes, particularly, and here's the racial breakdown, Ashkenazi Druze who are Polish, they're white, right? Polish, German, Russian, even though Russians are racialized a little bit differently. They are kind of the elite of the Israeli society, sorry. And then you have the Arab Jews, so people who are Mizrahi or Sephardic, right? Who are from like Spain, Greece, North Africa, Iraq, for example, Yemen. They're also Jewish, Ethiopia. They are less valuable because they're brown, right? We see this in any racist state, right? Then below them, you have the Druze who are Palestinian, but they're Druze, and there's different relationships with the Israeli state. Many of them are citizens, and they are Druze is a offset of the Muslim religion of Islam, and they are often speak Arabic. They're put on the front lines, and then underneath them you have Palestinians. So, and then it's unfortunately it's a really, really messed up and racialized system. So there is a lot of racism against Black and brown Jews in Israel. And then under them, you have migrant workers like Chinese migrant workers, Thai migrant workers, Filipino nurses, right? And you have lots of different rules for them. And then you have Palestinians. Lots of problems, just like here. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, let me just go ahead, Michael.
I didn't know about when you mentioned Hewlett Packard splitting. I didn't know that because I remember, because I'm a Methodist, I'm a member of the United Methodist Church, and so I'm part of the California Nevada Annual Conference, which is up in Northern California, so like Bay Area, Sacramento, Central Coast, and parts of Nevada. And we had an annual conference where we actually voted to also divest from Hewlett Packard, but little did I know about the split that happened between within Hewlett Packard, and I was just so, in a way, I was a little taken aback because they would. But I'm not surprised at the same time because they would really do that, and and it's just so. I guess this whole discussion has just been fascinating, but also very tragic.
Yeah.
And
Well,
Yeah.
the other thing, Michael, about Hewlett Packard to remember is that the Hewlett Packard has also provided the guidance system. Their technology provided the missile guidance system, which is the missiles that the Israeli government is using to bomb Gaza. And, and so when they were bombing all those other places, and when Israel used the target, the attacking Iran and Iraq and on their, nuclear buildup sites, that was all guidance system provided by Hewlett Packard. And that was the original of the protest against the military system, militarization. In so many ways, the Hewlett Packard made the Israeli military possible and their oppression of the Palestinians. And so that's why they were on their list. My fun story with the BDS and is when the time that I met Nadia, that we were 2017, I was on the interfaith trip. And before we left, we met in DC for training. That's where, when we're there. And then just a day before we left, somebody read in the Jerusalem paper that they were saying that there was going to be this BDS activist coming to Israel. And so we said, oh, hey, we're talking, go, hey, there's a group going just like that. Maybe we can connect with them and get to know them, see what they're up to. So we're all talking about what a wonderful thing would be, how coincidental there's another group that was going like this. So we get to the airport and 6 of our people can't get on. They're on a no-fly list. So Lufthansa would not let, because the Israeli government had to put 6 of our members who were on the trip on the no-fly, international no-fly list. And then we realized they were talking about us. So out of the 6, 7 that were total, they banned. And 1 made it anyway because they didn't fly on German airline. They flew an American airline, and American didn't even know what to do. So they just let the person fly, even though that person was no-fly list. And then 2 of them flew into Amman, Jordan, and then drove across the border. And then other 4 just never went altogether. So this is so I was part of this troublemaking group, I guess. And when we got to the airport, everybody was detained at the airport except for 2 of us. There was another guy who was Jewish, and then he played like a very excited young man coming home to visit homeland thing. And I played the Asian tourist. And every time they asked me a question, I said, what? Can you say that again? What did you say? Can you repeat that? And then they finally thought I didn't know what I was talking about, so they let me through.
Yeah. And that's the crazy thing, because, Israel is very much threatened by the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, even as a nonviolent action, because it's taking economic action to not normalize Israeli occupation. And that's kind of what Israel really relies on. Yes, they have a really strong military. Per your question, Michael, Israel actually gets the largest military aid package out of any country in the world. They get $30 billion in US military aid over 10 years, which is about $3.8 million every year. Billion dollars, 3.8 billion every year. That is more than the entire continent of Africa. The second is Egypt. Why? Because Egypt borders Israel. So during the normalization agreement that Egypt signed with Israel, they were permitted 1.5 billion every year. After that, it pegs off. Part of that is because Israel really is a friend to the United States. So when we look at different conflicts in the region, like Iraq or Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the US uses Israel military bases in order to launch attacks, right? So in the Iraq war, Israel was invested in that, right? So that's why it's another form of military power. And again, right, if you want to read more about Israeli anti-war movements, you're not going to find much information. I really encourage you to look. I really encourage you to do more research after this presentation and look more into the Intifadas, look more into Palestinian history, watch Naila and the Uprisings, watch Five Broken Cameras, watch Budrus. Another really good one about Palestinians inside of the state of Israel, quote unquote, is Slingshot Hip Hop. That's a really good one about the Palestinian hip hop scene. So I really encourage you all to look at this stuff and to read more. If you have questions, please reach out to me. It's an interesting time, particularly with the deal of the century. You know how I said normalization plan? Egypt and Jordan normalized relationships with Israel, and the US granted more permissions and more money to them to reward them for that. Now Bahrain, the UAE, and now Sudan, which is under intense economic situation, really, really hard. They are normalizing with the state of Israel, and the US is rewarding them through that. So situation with Sudan is really sad because they are experiencing mass poverty, hunger, and economic depression. And they're also, Sudan is on the terror list. I don't know if you all know that, as a country, which means that they can't get international loans. So there's no way to build infrastructure. Part of the deal for Sudan normalizing with Israel is for the US to actually remove them from the terror list, which means that they'll be able to get access to banks. So you see the way that also there's a barter system, right? And so it's a tough situation. It is tragic, but you know, I keep hope alive for the fact that we're going to be able to make changes to the system, because we are actually progressing in terms of consciousness on kind of what the situation is, what is our context, and there are actions that we can take that are along the lines of social justice and advocating for not just basic human rights, but also self-determination and dignity for all peoples, right? And equality for all peoples. And I don't think we've had the same opportunities before. So definitely tragic, but you know, as Palestinians, we also refuse to be victims. That's something that we tell our youth, and our elders tell us. We refuse to be victims of history. We are going to be live in a dignified way and make dignified demands, right? We have rights. No one owes us rights. We have our rights. We are demanding that those rights be recognized. What we are demanding is self-determination and equality.
Can you talk about life of young people, just so that they can relate to, you know, the people their age, how their lives are different than, or what young people might be experiencing in Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, many of you are, so you're in the university system and you're also working. So some of you might be working. So yeah, it's hard.
By the way.
Yeah, all students. If any of you are working, I mean, it looks like not being able to attend university or having a really hard time attending. So Al-Azhar University, for example, is a Palestinian university in Jerusalem. The wall actually bifurcates the campus. So you have the social science library on a different part of the wall than the hard science library. And so for Palestinians to actually study, they have to go through a checkpoint to go from one side to another. So you have mass occupation. For Palestinians who participate in Israeli universities. So my cousin is an Israeli citizen. She attends the Tel Aviv University, and she faces discrimination as a student. She has had, she petitioned to a professor to study with him because she felt like it would be an interesting topic to work with him. And he told her that he does not mentor Arabs. It's her word against his. She was not able to get justice in the system because he's a well-established professor and she is a Palestinian student. It really looks different depending on where you are, but it's hard. It looks like joblessness, not being able to access jobs that are going to support your family, that are interesting. It looks like not being able to be hired in the same percentage as Israelis because you don't have a military record, because you don't serve in the military. So it looks like also institutions not being as well funded. So Palestinian institutions not being as well funded, not having the same type of resources. It looks like raids on student organizing. So students are really, really active, just like here, right? Really, really active in justice issues. The Israeli military raids Birzeit campus often, right? And imprison students. There are Palestinian students who are in prison, right? That's what it looks like. It's really, really tough. It's really tough because there aren't many opportunities. Opportunities that there are constricted within the occupation. And of course, it looks like, you know, being with friends and wanting to hang out. But I can tell you guys that even when you want to go out, if you want to meet friends who are living in different areas, sometimes you're not going to be able to meet because you get stuck at a checkpoint, right? Or you want to go to a party, but sometimes there isn't water, right? There's no resources. So it is definitely a struggle. But you know, the internet helps keep people connected in different areas, but generally it's not easy. Oh, sorry, I missed you, Melody. Thank you.
No, yeah. Does anybody have any other thoughts, questions for Nadya?
Marika, do you have anything in particular?
Well, if not, then it's a little over time, but it's okay because I know for me personally, I've really enjoyed your presentation and on our discussion today, Nadya. So again, thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us. And again, this will be posted on our Facebook page. And so after the event. And so, yeah, so if there are not any other comments, we will end the session. And yeah. Thank you everyone so much. Well, at least I will end the recording. But if we want to stick around for some more,
Stick around for a couple of minutes.
Thanks, so.
Yeah, if Nadya, if you have
yeah, I'm fine. No worries.
Okay.
Well, Nadya, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I mean,
I
it's so
know.
important for them to get all the history.